On January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation came into effect. While it most famously freed all the slaves in the Confederate States, it also allowed for black men to serve in the Union Army. Later that same month, the Union Secretary of War, Edward M. Stanton, instructed the Governor of Massachusetts, John A. Andrew, to begin raising regiments of men of African descent. Andrew had been a longtime advocate of the idea of raising colored regiments, and at the time of receiving this order, Andrew had been in Washington, D.C., assisting in planning for the creation of these colored regiments. Andrew quickly returned to Boston and began the process of finding men to lead his colored regiments. Colored soldiers were only allowed to be enlisted men, meaning that Andrew would have to find a white officer willing to lead black men. A surprisingly difficult task. He wrote letters to numerous officers. On the 6th of February, Andrew received his yes from a man named Robert G. Shaw. Shaw came from a family of rich and well-known abolitionists from Long Island, New York. Upon arriving to Boston from Virginia on the 14th of February, Shaw met his second-in-command, a man named Norwood Penn Hallowell. At the time, both of these men were captains, and just by declaring they would lead a regiment of black men, Shaw was given 3 promotions to colonel, and Hallowell 2 to lieutenant colonel. Shaw and Hallowell quickly chose their supporting officers, the majority of which came from abolitionist families, one officer even being Hallowell's younger brother, Edward Needles Hallowell. Shaw and Hallowell then began what many thought would be an impossible task of recruiting black men for the Union. Many people in both the North and the South thought black men to be naturally cowardly, meaning few would ever volunteer to serve. Shaw and Hallowell found the opposite to be true, however. Abolitionists who wanted to dispel these racist myths often spoke in black churches in Boston to get black men to enlist. Ads were posted in local newspapers, and almost 100 men had been recruited by the end of February. After a few months of further recruiting and training, Shaw's regiment was ready for battle, and on May 13, 1863, they were mustered into federal service as the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment. On May 28th, the regiment prepared to embark to the south, and marched through the streets of Boston to their ships. They were met with great fanfare, as reported by one of the officers, Louis Millo.
All along the route, the sidewalks, windows, and balconies were thronged with spectators, and the appearance of the regiment caused repeating cheers and waving of flags and handkerchiefs. Passing a house on Wessex Street, William Lloyd Garrison was seen resting his hand on a bust of John Brown.
The 54th was in high morale boarding their transports in the Boston harbor, despite that almost exactly 1 year prior, Jefferson Davis declared that any black man who was captured by the Confederacy in battle would be sold into slavery, and that their white officers would be executed. On June 3rd, the 54th arrived in the town of Beaufort, South Carolina. They arrived too early in the day to attract much attention, but the few freed slaves that were awake at 4 a.m. would often cheer as they passed. Upon arriving to the military base at Hilton Head, just outside of Beaufort, the 54th was informed that they would only be paid $7 a month. Shaw immediately protested this. He and the men he had recruited had been promised $13 a month, plus pay for food and lodging, equal pay to that of a white soldier. Shaw was informed that he and his soldiers needed to have pay withheld to pay for their uniforms. No white regiments were required to pay for their uniforms. Shaw and his men began leading boycotts of the $7 pay on payday. The 54th would stay in Beaufort for only 4 days before being put into the field, attached to the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, a regiment of freed slaves. The first task that the 54th participated in was securing the many small island towns and plantations that were off the coast of South Carolina. The most famous of these operations were known as the Raid at Combahee Ferry, where the 54th and the 2nd, accompanied by Harriet Tubman, raided, pillaged, and torched the large plantation, after making quick work of the few Confederate troops in response to the raid, largely thanks to the fire support of 2 Union gunboats. The men of the 54th and the 2nd freed 750 slaves, many of whom would later enlist. After being ordered to burn and pillage an abandoned town in Georgia, Shaw complained to his commanding officers that this type of work was below troops of his caliber, and demanded that they be assigned to actual combat. Shaw's commander transferred him and his men from raiding operations to assist in the taking of Fort Wagner. Fort Wagner was part of a series of forts and other defenses designed to protect the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina from the Union's navy. Fort Wagner was considered an especially important target for the Union. because if it was taken by Union forces, the port would be effectively closed to Confederate ships. Fort Wagner was a very well-defended target. To the east was the Atlantic Ocean, and to the west a thick swamp. On the north of the island that Fort Wagner was built on, there was a heavily defended arsenal that could feed Fort Wagner reinforcements as needed. The fort itself was surrounded by a 30-foot tall wall of earthworks. Below that, there was a trench 10 feet wide and 5 feet deep, which was laced with landmines and palmetto trees carved into large spikes. Fort Wagner was manned by a 1,700-man garrison and had enough fortifications to protect at least 1,000 of those men from heavy naval bombardment. Despite these defenses, the Union had decided that the only way they could take the fort was with an all-out assault. The first of these assaults failed spectacularly, with the Union taking 339 casualties to the Confederacy's 12. Roughly a week after the first assault, the second assault's plan was put into motion. The first stage was a small skirmish known as the Battle of Grimball's Landing. Grimball's Landing was on the opposite side of the same island that Fort Wagner was on. The goal of this attack was to divert Confederate forces away from Fort Wagner. This was the first time that the 54th saw action. Union Marines set up defenses in a marsh at Grimball's Landing on the 8th of July, while Major General Alfred Terry led roughly half of his 3,800 men, including the 54th, to harass nearby Confederate fortifications before retreating into the marsh. On the 16th, the Confederates responded, but they had not adequately scouted this marsh and were unprepared for the difficult terrain. However, the Confederate forces still charged Union fortifications. One soldier of the 54th, after being surrounded by 3 Confederate cavalrymen, took 2 down with just his bayonet, and was stabbed 3 times by the 3rd before he fell. The Confederate attack on the marsh quickly fell apart, and the Union repelled them, and quickly withdrew back to Fort Wagner. Because of the 54th's exceptional showing at the fight, Shaw requested that they lead the assault on Fort Wagner. Shaw was granted his request. Because of the narrow terrain, only 1 regiment of infantry could advance on the fort at a time, and the 54th would be the first to go. The Union had 3 brigades of 9 regiments each, plus 3 ironclads for artillery support. This equates to roughly 5,000 men in all. At 7:45 p.m., following an intense artillery barrage, the 54th began to advance on the fort, with the ultimate goal of reaching the western salient, or the part of the fort that stuck the furthest out. Shaw advanced with his regiment, unlike the other colonels of the regiments that participated in the battle. The 54th advanced unopposed and quite easily until they were about 150 yards away from the fort. At that point, the Confederates opened up on the 54th with artillery fire, canister shot, and small arms. The shrapnel and bullets tore through their ranks. During one of these barrages, the flag bearer was struck and killed by a bullet. As the flag fell, another nearby sergeant by the name of William Harvey Carney grabbed the flag and loudly declared, "Boys, this old flag will never touch the ground." For this act, he would become the first black man to win a Congressional Medal of Honor. The 54th continued their advance despite their casualties and would reach the wall of Fort Wagner. After scaling it, Shaw mounted the wall and shouted, "Forward, 54th!" He was shot 3 times and died nearly instantly. After hours of hand-to-hand combat, the 54th and their supporting regiments had taken heavy casualties and were forced to retreat around 10 that night. Of the 600 men in the 54th who assaulted Fort Wagner, 270 of them were killed, captured, or wounded. The Union requested that Shaw's body be returned to them so that he could be properly buried. The fort's commander simply told the officer making the request, "We buried him with his N-words," and even clarified that if he had been commanding white men, Shaw's body would have been returned. The regimental surgeon wrote to Shaw's father to explain why he wouldn't be able to bury his child. Shaw's father proudly replied with, "We would not have his body removed from where it lies, surrounded by his brave and devoted soldiers. We can imagine no holier place than that in which he lies, among his brave and devoted followers, nor wish for him better company. What a bodyguard he has." After Shaw's death, Lieutenant Edward Needles Hallowell, Lieutenant Colonel Norwood Hallowell's younger brother, was promoted to colonel. He made getting his troops equal pay his #1 priority. Under his command, the refusal of the $7 pay continued and even became a point of honor for the men of the 54th. At the Battle of Olustee, the next major battle the 54th participated in, The 54th was ordered to protect the rear of the retreating Union forces. As the 54th charged by their retreating comrades, they chanted, "Massachusetts and 7 a month." Eventually, on June 19, 1864, Congress signed a bill authorizing that any man that had been free prior to April of 1861 equal pay. Many of the men in the 54th at this point did not qualify for pay under those restrictions. Because Colonel Hallowell was a Quaker and did not believe in slavery, he had all of his men say what he called the Quaker Oath. "You do solemnly swear that you owed no man unrequited labor on or before the 19th day of April, 1861. So help you God." The men of the 54th received their back pay on September 28, 1864. By then, most of the men had served 18 months. Throughout the rest of the war, the 54th continued to serve in distinction, while also railing against the racism and inequality that they faced from their comrades, enemies, commanding officers, and even the government that was asking the men of the 54th to die for it. The actions of the 54th proved to many Northerners that their antiquated and racist views on the character of black men were wrong. Some abolitionists had hoped that having black men fight for the Union would help the cause of gaining equal rights in the soon-to-be-restored United States. However, it would take 100 years to gain equal rights under the laws of their country, and the fight to defeat racism continues to this day.